It was a sunny summer day at a posh country club. The pool sparkled like jewels, reflecting the cloudless blue sky. The sounds of children giggling in the cool water, and the quiet chatter of adults in lounge chairs, with cold drinks echoed throughout. Everything seemed perfect until a sharp, scratchy voice called out, "What is he doing in this pool?" All eyes turned to the woman standing at the water's edge. It was Mrs. Caroline Whitman, known for her quick comments and sense of superiority. Her lightly tanned face was contorted with indignation as she pointed at the boy in the pool. It was Jason, a black teenager sitting in a wheelchair that had been left at the edge. Jason had just descended into the water via a special lift installed for people with disabilities. He tried to be inconspicuous, moving quietly along the edge, enjoying the coolness of the water on a hot day, but for some reason, his presence made Mrs. Whitman resentful. "This is against all the rules," she said loudly, her voice ringing like a counterfeit coin. "The pool is a place for relaxation, not for people like him." "Excuse me," came a soft but surprised voice. It was a young employee of the club who approached Mrs. Whitman. "The boy is not breaking any rules. We have rules that allow people with disabilities to use all the facilities of the club." But Mrs. Whitman was not going to be appeased. "This is unacceptable," she said indignantly, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat. "He spoils the atmosphere. People pay good money to come here for a holiday, not to see scenes like this." "What scenes?" The employee's voice became firmer, but she tried to remain professional. "Well, you know what I mean." Whitman waved her hand. "It's unpleasant. The water in the pool should be clean. Who knows what kind of problems it has." Those words silenced even the most talkative guests. Jason heard everything. He looked at Mrs. Whitman with an expression that was both confused and calm. It seemed like he wanted to say something, but instead he just sighed, his hands clenching on the edge of the pool. "We have equal rights here for everyone," the employee said, turning to Mrs. Whitman. "We can't ask him to leave just because you don't like his presence." But the woman seemed adamant. "If you don't remove it, I'll call the manager and the police if necessary." Jason, hearing these words, silently swam to the lift to get out of the water. He felt all eyes on him. He didn't want to make a scene, but every step he took, every movement in this place seemed to become a reason for condemnation. As he rose from the pool and climbed into his wheelchair, Mrs. Whitman gave him a cold look. "I hope you realize this is no place for the likes of you," she said, turning away. But Jason said nothing. He just looked at her, his eyes not hurt but defiant. He knew this day would be the start of something bigger than just a poolside argument. This was a fight he couldn't lose. Jason slowly backed away from the pool, wiping water from his face. The sun no longer felt warm and enveloping. It felt harsh and unforgiving, as if it, too, was judging him for being here. His wheelchair creaked slightly as he moved across the tiles, each sound seeming to amplify, casting a shadow over the day. Mrs. Whitman couldn't let this go. She looked at Jason like a predator at prey. Her eyes narrowed. She raised her head, adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, and walked straight toward him. The crowd at the pool watched the scene in silence, some with interest, others with discomfort. "Do you always go where you don't belong?" Her voice was cold, like a blade cutting through the silence. Jason stopped, turning the stroller so he could look at her. His voice was calm but firm. "I just wanted to swim. There's a lift here that helps me do that. Did I do something wrong?" Mrs. Whitman chuckled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "You've made everyone here uncomfortable. Look around you." She made a sweeping gesture. "People came here to relax, to unwind. Instead, they're forced to see." She paused, obviously choosing the word she thought would hurt the most. "See you, May?" Jason asked, his voice still level but his eyes blazing. "What's wrong with me?" "That's it," she said sharply. "This pool is for normal people, and you don't fit in." The crowd began to exchange glances. Some guests looked away nervously, but no one intervened. The club's manager, a tall white man in an immaculately pressed shirt and an artificial smile, appeared at the pool, drawn by the noise. His name was Mr. Randall, and he was known for his love of rules and his hatred of problems. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice even, but his gaze already fixated on Jason with disapproval. Mrs. Whitman turned to him at once, her expression a mixture of indignation and triumph. "That boy is disrupting the atmosphere of the club. I have complained repeatedly that such." She paused and curled her lips, as he should not be here. The manager frowned, his gaze sliding over Jason, assessing him as if he were an object rather than a person. Mrs. Whitman, I'm sure we can settle this peacefully. Peacefully, she cried. Are you going to let him stay? Jason looked straight at the manager, his voice firm, even though he could feel the anger building inside. I didn't do anything wrong. I have as much right to be here as anyone else. The manager shook his head, coming closer. Listen, but this place is for customers who want to feel comfortable. Maybe you should look for another place to relax. Why? Because I'm in a wheelchair, or because I'm black? Jason's voice took on a sharpness that hadn't been there before. These words made the people around him freeze. The manager looked at the crowd, realizing that his words could have consequences. But instead of being wise, he decided to double down on his position. No need to make a scene, he said, frowning. You're causing trouble, and I don't want other customers complaining. Problems? Jason asked, his voice shaking with anger. You're the ones causing the problems. I came here to enjoy the pool, not to listen to your prejudices. Mrs. Whitman chuckled. Prejudice? Are you serious? It's just common sense. There are places for people like you, but this isn't one of them. Jason looked straight at her, his eyes flashing. You know what's scary? It's not my problem. It's your hatred. You think you can decide who deserves to be here and who doesn't, but that's not your privilege. These words caused a slight whisper in the crowd. Someone said quietly, he is right. But the manager interrupted. That's enough. If you don't leave now, I'll call security. Jason took a deep breath, his hands gripping the armrests of the wheelchair tightly. Call them. Let them explain to me why I have no right to be here. The manager frowned. He realized that the situation was out of his control, but instead of admitting it, he took a step back, gesturing toward the exit. You chose this path. Bye. Jason didn't move. In that moment, he realized that this bow wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had faced injustice and remained silent. He wasn't going to stay silent anymore. The crowd around the pool slowly dispersed, leaving Jason alone with his humiliators. Those who remained were silent, as if they had become mute witnesses, not daring to intervene. Jason Saturday in his wheelchair, trying to keep his back straight despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. His heart was pounding so loudly that it seemed everyone could hear it, but his face remained calm, almost stony. Mrs. Whitman, now even more furious, took a step forward, looming over Jason like a predator ready to strike the killing blow. You know why you don't belong here? Her voice was laced with venom. Because you're a reminder that there are people who will never be our equals, no matter how much they want to be. Jason looked up at her, his gaze hard but silent. You think your opinion means anything? He finally said, his voice level but sharp. What you say only reflects you, not me. Mrs. Whitman laughed, her laugh cold and sharp, like ice cracking underfoot. Do you really think anyone will protect you? Look around you. No one is interfering. No one will say a word in your defense, because deep down, they agree with me. Jason fell silent, but his gaze darted to the crowd. He saw faces, some looking away, others looking at the ground. There were those who seemed sympathetic, but no one stepped forward. No one dared challenge her words. Mr. Randall, the club's manager, returned from a brief conversation with security. He walked up to Mrs. Whitman and nodded at her, as if acknowledging her right to everything that was happening. We called security to deal with this problem, he said, addressing the crowd rather than Jason. We can't have situations like this ruining the atmosphere of our club. Jason gritted his teeth, trying not to let his emotions get the better of him. You called that solving the problem? He asked, his voice shaking but determined. You solve the problem by removing someone you don't like. It's not a matter of convenience. But, Randall said, frowning, it's a matter of meeting the standards of our club. We have to consider the comfort of all our customers. Comfort? Jason glanced at Mrs. Whitman, then back at the manager. Comfort is a right only for people like you. Mrs. Whitman cut him off sharply. You can throw around accusations all you want, but the truth is, you're out of place here. You don't feed our image. Your image? Jason asked quietly. His hands tightened on the armrest of the wheelchair. Do you think I'm unnecessary because I'm black, or because I'm disabled, or because I remind you that your perfection is an illusion? His words caused a murmur of whispers among the remaining spectators. Mrs. Whitman paled, her smug smile wavering slightly, but the hatred in her eyes only grew stronger. You dare say such things to me? You, who shouldn't even be here. Mr. Randall intervened again, his voice rougher. I think we should end this conversation. Bye. You really should leave before this gets any worse. At that moment, security entered the pool area. Two men in uniform approached Jason, their faces impassive, but their movements hesitant. They clearly understood that the situation was already out of control. Excuse me, to her, but we need you to leave the area, one of them said. Jason looked up, his gaze focused. Are you kicking me out because I broke a rule, or because I'm disturbing your comfort? The guards looked at each other but said nothing. Jason looked back at the crowd. You all see this? His voice grew louder. You see how hate is normalized, how the color of one's skin or their wheelchair is a reason to disqualify someone from being here. Someone in the crowd shouted, leave him alone. He didn't do anything. Mrs. Whitman turned to the voice, her face twisted in anger. Shut up. It's none of your business. But that voice was the first of many. People began to whisper, some vocalizing their disagreement. Jason felt the atmosphere change. Mr. Randall, sensing that the situation was getting out of hand, motioned for the guards to act. Take him away, he said coldly. But as the guards stepped toward Jason, a woman stepped out of the crowd. Her face was determined, her voice loud. Don't touch him. If you throw him out, I'll leave too. And me, added another voice. Suddenly, several people began to speak up for Jason. Their voices grew louder until Mrs. Whitman and Mr. Randall realized they were losing control. Jason felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. Even under the weight of humiliation, he knew that the truth would always find support. But he knew this was only the beginning. The battle for equality was not over. Mrs. Whitman frowned, her expression a mixture of anger and bewilderment. The crowd, which had been silently watching her performance moments before, began to tear at her illusion of control. People who had not intervened until now were now speaking louder, their indignation becoming palpable. This is outrageous, said a middle-aged man standing in the front row. We came here to relax, not to watch such humiliation. Why do you think you have the right to decide who can be here? A woman holding a child asked loudly. This boy has the same rights as we do. Mrs. Whitman turned to the crowd, her eyes darting from face to face. Her confidence was beginning to waver, but she stubbornly refused to give in. You all don't know what you're talking about. Her voice was sharp and nervous. It's not personal. I just want our club to stay the way it's always been. Clean, comfortable, decent, worthy. The young man interjected, his voice furious. What's unworthy about that? You call his presence a threat. The crowd began to whisper louder. People who had seemed passive observers just a moment ago were now taking Jason's side. The guards, seeing the tense atmosphere, frowsy, unsure of what to do. But Mrs. Whitman wasn't going to back down. Her face flushed with anger, and she turned back to Jason, who had been sitting in his wheelchair the entire time, staring at her. You're just using your situation to gain pay, she blurted out. You think you can win just because people feel sorry for you. Jason lifted his head, his voice calm but each word a blow. I don't seek pity. I demand respect. That's what you don't seem to understand. These words silenced the crowd. Even Mr. Randall frowned, his expression changing from confidence to confusion. People looked at Jason with respect that became more and more obvious. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. A woman in a formal suit appeared from behind the crowd, her steps determined, her face expressed cold determination, and in her hands she held a folder with documents. It was Amelia James, Jason's mother. What's going on here? Her voice sounded so loud and confident that everyone turned around. Mrs. Whitman narrowed her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. Who are you? She asked, her voice sharp. Amelia stepped closer, her eyes meeting Mrs. Whitman's. I am the mother of this boy you are humiliating, and it seems time for me to remind you that this club does not belong to you personally. The crowd began to roar again, but this time the noise was filled with support. People began to clap, showing their approval. Amelia continued, I am a lawyer, and I don't have to tell you that your racist attack violates human rights laws. You publicly humiliated my son, insulted him, and tried to deny him the right to be here. Mrs. Whitman paled, her smug expression turned to fear, but she tried to keep her face. I wasn't being mean, she said, but her voice was shaking. I was just expressing my opinion. Your opinion is racism, Amelia said firmly, and it will no longer go unpunished. Mr. Randall, who had remained silent until then, tried to intervene. "Please, let's calm down. We all want to settle this peacefully." Amelia turned to him, her gaze cold. "Peacefully? You watched my son get bullied and did nothing. You supported her behavior, and that makes you just as guilty." Randall muttered, but the crowd was no longer supporting him. People began asking questions, accusing him of inaction, demanding explanations. Mrs. Whitman, feeling that she was losing control, turned sharply and headed for the exit. Her voice still sounded confident, but there were notes of despair in it. "You will all go crazy if you start listening to people like them. It will destroy our world, our comfort." But her words were drowned out by the applause that was directed at Jason and Amelia. The people she considered her support had now turned their backs on her. Amelia leaned toward Jason, her voice softening. "You did it. You showed yourself worthy of respect, even when they tried to make you feel like nothing." Jason smiled, but there was a hint of weariness in his eyes. "I just wish this never happened to anyone else." "We will do everything to make it so," Amelia replied. Mrs. Whitman left the pool, her pride shattered. She realized that her world, founded on hatred and prejudice, was no longer safe, and Jason was left not only a winner, but a symbol of change that no one could stop. Mrs. Whitman, humiliated and angry, was not going to let it go. Her face was burning with a mixture of rage and embarrassment. She stopped at the exit of the pool, but instead of leaving, she turned back. Her eyes were flashing, her voice was sharp and high, like the sound of cracking glass. She could not afford to lose in the eyes of the crowd that a moment ago she considered hers. "It's not over yet," she snapped, turning to Jason and Amelia. "You think you can just come in here and disrupt the order and make everyone dance to your tune? Not in my club." Her words cut through the air, causing the crowd to freeze once more. People looked at her with growing confusion, but she no longer noticed their gazes. Her goal was clear: to crush Jason, to prove her power, even if it required extreme measures. Amelia stood before her son, her posture firm, her face icy calm. "You continue to humiliate my son despite everything that has happened," she said, her voice quiet but a syllable a sentence. "Why, what do you want to prove?" Mrs. Whitman chuckled, her lips twisting into a cruel smile. "I want to prove that people like you can't just come in here and act like you can get away with anything. This club was created for people who value order and tradition, not for people who use their problems to manipulate society." "Problems?" Jason asked, his voice shaking but his dignity intact. "You call my life a problem?" "Exactly," the woman said sharply, taking a step forward. "You're not just a problem. You're the embodiment of everything that's ruining our world. You think people owe you just because you have a wheelchair and—" She paused, her eyes flashing with hatred, a certain skin color. These words caused a murmur of indignation in the crowd. People began to talk among themselves, some openly expressing their indignation. But Mrs. Whitman seemed to have support. Her smug smile grew wider. "You just want attention," she continued. "You want people to see you and pity you. Well, you got it, but know this: all the pity in the world will not make you our equal." Amelia stepped forward, her face cold and hard. "You have crossed all boundaries," she said. "What you are saying is not just prejudice, it is pure hatred, and you will have to answer for it." Whitman asked mockingly, "What are you going to do?" "Sumi, look at these people." She gestured at the crowd. "They won't do anything. They're afraid, because deep down, they know I'm right." The crowd frowned, but suddenly an elderly woman stepped out of it. Her face was worried but determined. She stood next to Amelia and said loudly, "No, we are not afraid. We have just been silent for too long." Several more people followed her. They began to speak out. "Enough. We will not tolerate such hatred. He is a man like the rest of us." Mrs. Whitman frowned, her complacency beginning to waver. "You're all crazy. You're letting these people destroy everything we've spent years building." But this time her words fell on deaf ears. People turned away from her. Her support vanished like sand blown away by the wind. She took a step back, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Amelia walked up to Jason, placing her hand on his shoulder. "You're strong," she said quietly. "Don't let her words break you." Jason looked up, his eyes meeting Mrs. Whitman's. "Your words cannot break me," he said, "because I know that truth always wins." Mrs. Whitman couldn't answer. She turned and walked away quickly, her steps sharp, almost hysterical. People looked after her, but no one stopped her. No one was on her side anymore. As she disappeared through the club gates, Amelia looked out at the crowd. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for standing up for what's right." People started clapping. It was the moment when hatred was defeated. Jason looked at those who now stood next to him, and for the first time that day, he felt that he was not alone. This was a small but important victory. Mrs. Whitman had left the pool, but her presence hung over the club like a heavy cloud. Jason could still feel the effects of her words, her hatred, despite the support of the people who had sided with him. He felt a chill inside, as if something sinister still had a hold on him. Amelia, trying to remain calm, led her son into the shade so he could rest for a moment. Her face remained calm, but her hands were shaking. She knew this wasn't over. This wasn't just an incident by the pool, it was a sign of something bigger, something that was already taking root. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitman headed toward the club's administration building. Her steps were quick, sharp, like hammer blows. She rushed inside, ignoring the surprised looks of the staff. In the office Saturday, Mr. Randall, who tried to look confident, but his face betrayed his anxiety. "You don't understand what just happened," she began, almost screaming. "That boy and his mother are going to destroy everything if we don't stop them." Randall looked up, trying not to show his irritation. "Mrs. Whitman, the situation is in her control. People supported them because they were emotionally involved. But tomorrow, all this will be forgotten." "Forget?" She chuckled, her voice dangerously low. "Do you seriously think they'll forget? That boy knows how to manipulate people. He plays the victim to get sympathy. And if we let them stay, it'll be the end of our club." Randall sighed, leaning back in his chair. "What do you suggest?" "Make sure they can't come here again," she said, her voice icy. "Find a reason, any reason. They must be excluded." Meanwhile, at the other end of the club, Jason Saturday in the shadows, looking at the people who continued to swim and relax as if nothing had happened. His mother Saturday down next to him, her gaze directed into the distance. "You did well," she said, not looking away. "You showed that you deserve to be here, that you deserve respect." "But why are they like this?" he asked quietly. "Why are there always those who think that we don't deserve to be here?" Amelia looked at him, her face serious. "Because the world is crumbling, Jason. They're used to thinking that they're the only ones entitled to everything. And when someone like you proves otherwise, they become afraid." She wanted to say something else, but their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a man in a security guard uniform. He stopped in front of them, his face expressing a mixture of awkwardness and severity. "I'm sorry to disturb you, madam," to her, he began, "but Mr. Randall has asked you to come into his office. He wishes to speak to you about what has happened." Amelia and Jason exchanged glances. She squeezed her son's hand, her eyes saying, "We can do this." They stood up and headed toward the administration building. When they entered the office, Mr. Randall was sitting behind his desk, his face as impassive as ever. Mrs. Whitman was standing next to him, her gaze fixed squarely on them, as if she were preparing for the final blow. "Mrs. Jason, thank you for coming," Randall began. "I want to discuss the situation that happened at the pool." "Of course," Amelia replied, her voice even. "We also want to discuss how your club allows open racism and hatred towards people with disabilities." Randall hesitated, but quickly recovered. "I understand your feelings, but we must consider the interests of all our clients. We have received several complaints that your presence is causing tension." "Tension," Amelia repeated, her voice sharp. "You call this tension? This is downright humiliation and discrimination." Mrs. Whitman interrupted, her voice loud and arrogant. "Nobody wants you here, and that's a fact. You think you can come here and change everything, but this is not the place for you." Jason, who had been silent until then, finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but firm. "This is a place for everyone, or at least it should be." These words caused silence in the room. Even Randall could not speak, but Mrs. Whitman was not about to give in. "If you don't leave this club," she said, narrowing her eyes, "I'll do everything I can to get you expelled." "Try it," Amelia answered firmly, "and then you will know what the real law is." Randall felt the tension in the room growing, but before he could say anything, there was a knock on the door. It was another employee of the club, looking worried. "Sorry to disturb you," he said as he entered, "but there are reporters at the club gates. They heard about what happened and want a comment." Whitman's face turned pale at these words. She looked at Randall and then at Amelia. You told them?" Her voice was full of panic. "No," Amelia replied, smiling. "The truth always finds a way to come out." Randall realized that the situation was out of his control. He looked at Mrs. Whitman, who now looked cornered, and at Amelia and Jason, who stood like symbols of justice. He knew that this day would change everything. The room was silent, except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. The looks in Randall's office were tense, like a string about to snap. Amelia stood next to Jason, like a fortress protecting her son from the torrent of hatred coming from Mrs. Whitman. Randall, sitting at his desk, was clearly confused, but tried to maintain the appearance of control. "Mrs. James," he began, addressing Amelia, his voice strained, as if he were choosing each word with utmost care. "Let us try to find a compromise. We all want the same thing here, to keep peace and order in our club. Your compromise is a cover for discrimination." Amelia replied coldly, her eyes flashing. "My son has done nothing to deserve this treatment. The only ones disturbing the peace here are you and that woman." Mrs. Whitman's head snapped up, her face flushed with anger. "How dare you say that? I'm the one defending the rights of the majority. We don't want this club to become a public swimming pool for everyone. We pay for exclusivity." Jason looked straight at her, his voice even, but every sentence cutting like a blade. "Exclusivity? You call that exclusivity? I call that fear. You're afraid the world isn't yours anymore." Her face twisted, and she took a step forward, pointing a finger at him. "You don't understand anything. People like you always play the victim. You use your disability, your skin color, to elicit pity, but that doesn't work here." Randall raised his hand, trying to intervene. "Mrs. Whitman, please," but Amelia cut him off, her voice like a hammer. "Enough. This woman is the embodiment of what should not be tolerated in our society. She openly states that my son has no right to be here, simply because it does not feed into her narrow worldview." Whitman snapped, her voice shaking. "This is order, and people like you are trying to destroy it." At that moment, the office door swung open and a man in a formal suit walked in. It was one of the club's board members, who had come to sort out the situation after calls from concerned club members. His face was serious, and he immediately sensed the tense atmosphere. "What's going on here?" His voice was deep and commanding. He looked around at the assembled group. Randall stood up, trying to sound confident. "It's a minor misunderstanding, Mr. Harding. We're trying to settle it peacefully." "A misunderstanding?" Amelia asked, her voice growing louder. "Your club allows open racism and discrimination. My son was humiliated and attacked simply because he is different." Mr. Harding frowned, his gaze falling on Mrs. Whitman. "Is that true?" he asked sternly. "Really," she protested, "I'm the victim here. This boy and his mother are stirring up trouble for attention. They want to make a show out of it." Jason finally snapped. "You think I like being here and proving my right to exist? You think I want to fight every day for people to see me as a human being?" His words silenced everyone. Even Mrs. Whitman lost her confidence. The crowd that had now gathered outside the office door to watch the proceedings began to whisper. Mr. Harding raised his hand, gesturing toward Mrs. Whitman. "Your words are unacceptable. We cannot allow our club to be associated with such behavior." "You can't be serious," she cried. "I'm one of the oldest members of the club. You have no right to kick me out. We have a right to protect our reputation." Harding replied, "And you, Mrs. Whitman, are violating everything this club is supposed to represent." She turned to Randall, her voice pleading. "You're going to let them do this to me?" Randall looked down. "You've gone too far, Mrs. Whitman." Amelia hugged Jason, her eyes full of pride. "Today has been a hard day, but this is just the beginning." Mrs. Whitman left the office, her pride crushed, but her eyes said she wasn't done. She was the type of person who didn't accept defeat, but for Jason and his mother, it was a victory, albeit a bittersweet one. As they left the office, the crowd applauded them. It was the moment when truth and justice began to triumph over hatred, but the shadows of the past still lingered, reminding them that the fight was not over. The night had shrouded the club in darkness, but the tension in the air seemed to be threatening to tear it apart. Even though Mrs. Whitman had left the building in humiliation, her influence was felt like a poison slowly spreading through the system. People in the club were whispering, some criticizing her behavior, others silently sharing her views. Jason could feel it, even after the crowd applauded him and his mother. He could see the shadow of doubt in their eyes. It wasn't approval, it was polite support to avoid open confrontation. Amelia knew that a fight like this didn't end with words. She walked her son to the exit, their footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. But at every turn, she felt like they were being watched. It wasn't that someone was actually following them, but the atmosphere of the club had become hostile. It was no longer a safe place. "Mom, do you think they'll let us come back here?" Jason asked quietly, his voice full of doubt. Amelia stopped, looking him in the eye. "We have a right to be here, Jason. It doesn't matter what they think. We're going to fight for it." But she knew that wasn't the whole truth. Deep down, she felt that their fight had only just begun, and that there would be more hatred than justice ahead. Meanwhile, across the club, Mrs. Whitman Saturday in her car, parked in a dark corner of the lot. Her face was furious, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She could no longer contain the storm of emotion that was raging inside her. For her, this day had been more than just a humiliation. It had been a betrayal. She took out her phone and began dialing. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but cold. "Yes, they're trying to destroy everything we've built," she hissed. "That boy and his mother, they make us feel like criminals just for standing up for our rights." "You know what to do," the voice replied. "We won't let this continue." Her lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Let them learn what it means to challenge those who have always ruled this world." The morning at the club began with tension. The employees discussed what had happened. Some tried to ignore the topic, but rumors spread quickly. Jason and Amelia, despite warnings, decided to return. They knew their presence would be met with controversy, but they were not about to give in. As they entered, the employees' faces were a mixture of surprise and alarm. Many of them were clearly avoiding eye contact, but the most surprising thing was that Mrs. Whitman was there again. She was sitting by the pool, surrounded by several other members who were looking at Amelia and Jason with cold disdain. "They're back," Whitman said loudly, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's amazing how some people don't realize they don't belong here." Amelia stopped, her gaze darting to the woman. She felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "We came back because we have a right to be here," she said firmly. Whitman laughed. "Really? You think your big talk and grandstanding gives you the right to be part of this community? That's ridiculous." Jason took a step forward, his voice quiet but strong. "Community? You call it a community if it excludes people just because they're different." "Different?" Whitman's lips curled. "You're not just different. You're a threat. People like you destroy the order. You make us feel guilty for who we are." These words made many freeze. Even those who had previously supported her now began to doubt. But instead of stopping, she continued, "Your skin color, your disability, these are not your virtues. They are your tools to manipulate people. And your prejudices are your weakness," Jason replied sharply. The words struck like a blow. The crowd began to murmur. Some supported Jason. Others were clearly outraged. The atmosphere became tense. Suddenly, reporters arrived at the club. Their cameras and microphones attracted everyone's attention. They began asking questions, their cameras recording every detail of what was happening. Whitman was confused. Her face went pale. "Do you want the whole world to know about your behavior?" Amelia asked, looking straight at her. "Because we are ready to tell." But Whitman, instead of backing down, gathered all her strength and blurted out, "Tell them, let them know how you're trying to destroy our world with your demands and playing the victim." The cameras immediately picked up on her words. Reporters began asking her questions, but she turned away and hurried away. The crowd stood still, watching, and then began to disperse, leaving Amelia and Jason in the spotlight. That day marked a turning point. Jason and Amelia knew the fight was far from over, but they also knew their voices had grown louder, their truth stronger. The world Whitman had tried to protect was beginning to crumble. The sun was high above the club, but tension hung over the area like a cloud. The club was seething after the morning's row by the pool. Mrs. Whitman, though she had left the scene with an expression of indignation, had planned to return and assert her right to supremacy. But neither she nor the rest of the club, including Randall, could have foreseen what would happen next. Jason and Amelia, despite the hostility, remained at the club. They felt that their every move and every word was being scrutinized, but this only strengthened their resolve. They understood that this fight was not just for themselves, but for those who face discrimination on a daily basis. But soon the tension in the club reached its peak. A car with tinted windows pulled up smoothly to the main entrance. Its arrival did not go unnoticed, club employees whispered. Club members looked around with interest. When the car door opened, a tall woman with a firm gaze and an aura of confidence stepped onto the porch that made everyone around her freeze. It was Jason's mother, not just a lawyer, as they thought, but the state governor, Amelia James. When Amelia entered the club, the air seemed to thin. Her steps were firm and confident, her gaze sharp but calm. Her appearance caused a wave of whispers. Those who had recently shared women's views began to exchange glances with growing unease. Mrs. Whitman, who had just returned to the pool, immediately noticed the unusual movement among the people. When she saw Amelia, she frowned, trying to understand why her appearance caused such a reaction. But she, of course, did not know who Amelia really was. "Oh, here you go again," Whitman said sarcastically, rising from her chaise. "Are you really going to continue this circus?" Amelia paused, her face unreadable. She looked at Whitman carefully, and then said, her voice loud and clear, "I didn't start this circus." "You did." Whitman laughed, but there was confusion in her laughter. "Who are you to judge me?" Amelia took a step closer, her gaze hard. "I am the governor of this state, and I am here to protect my son's rights, which you so easily chose to take away." The words sounded like a clap of thunder. The crowd gathered around the pool frowned. Mrs. Whitman was momentarily speechless. She opened her mouth to speak, but could find no words. Her face turned crimson and she took a step back. "Gee, Governor," she finally managed, her voice shaking, Is this some kind of prank?" "This is not a prank," Amelia replied calmly. "I am not here as a politician. I am here as a mother who will not allow her son to be humiliated because of the color of his skin or because of his disability." The crowd began to whisper. Some looked surprised, others scared, but the atmosphere had changed. Where Jason and Amelia had seemed isolated before, they were now the center of attention, and more people were showing their support. "This is outrageous," said one of the club members. "No one has the right to treat a child like this." "She's right," someone else added. "Racism and hatred should not be part of our society." The man who had been silent before said loudly. Mrs. Whitman tried to maintain the last of her dignity, but her voice sounded weak and unconvincing. I wanted to protect our club from what?" Amelia interrupted sharply. "From a boy who just wanted to swim, from a person who is different from you, or from a truth you don't want to accept." Mrs. Whitman fell silent, her expression a mixture of shame and anger. She looked around, but no one was supporting her anymore. Her allies were silent, avoiding her gaze. At this time, the reporters who had arrived earlier began to photograph and film what was happening. Questions rained down on Amelia, but she remained focused. "This isn't just about my son," she said, addressing the crowd. "This is about every person who has ever experienced injustice. We have to be better. We have to fight hatred and prejudice wherever it exists." Applause rang out around the pool. Jason looked at his mother, his eyes shining with pride. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was no longer alone in his struggle. Mrs. Whitman hurried away, her face a picture of defeat. But her departure was not the end. The club decided to hold a meeting to review its rules and values. Randall, realizing that his inaction had led to a scandal, resigned. For Jason, that day marked the beginning of a new chapter. People who had once turned their backs on him began to show their support. His story made headlines, inspiring thousands across the state. Amelia, despite everything that had happened, knew that the fight was not over, but now she knew that they were not alone, and that was the greatest victory. Mrs. Whitman ran toward her car, trying not to make eye contact with anyone who remained by the pool. Her breathing was ragged, and her heels clicked loudly on the stone path, as if measuring the beats of her heart. Her ears were ringing. It seemed as if all eyes, all cameras, the entire world were focused on her. She had always been protected by status, money, and surroundings, and now it was all crumbling before her eyes. She struggled to open the car door, got behind the wheel, and slammed the door shut as if she were trying to shut out the outside world. Her hands shook as she inserted the key into the ignition. The car started with a loud roar that seemed to drown out her rapid breathing. She wanted to drive as far away as possible, but something stopped her. She leaned over the wheel, her fingers gripping the leather upholstery so tightly that her knuckles turned white. This is all wrong, she whispered under her breath, her voice desperate. They've made me out to be a monster. She raised her head, looking in the rearview mirror. Her own reflection seemed alien to her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. This was not the woman she was used to seeing. Where was the confidence? Where was the strength? It was all gone, replaced by growing fear. She grabbed the phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number. A familiar voice answered on the other end, but it sounded colder than usual. "Hello. You have to help me," she said quickly. "This is getting out of hand. They're making me out to be a racist. All these people, the governor. Do you understand? She's the governor, and her son is their tool to destroy everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Whitman, do you realize what you've done?" The voice finally said. "It's not just the club that's hurt. It's on the news. Your name is associated with hate, but it's not my fault," she cried. "I was just trying to protect our club, our order. It doesn't matter anymore." The voice snapped. "No one will protect you." She paused. The words hit her harder than any accusation. She had always believed herself to be part of something bigger, something that could not be broken. But now that she had tried to use that power, she was alone. She threw the phone onto the passenger seat, her eyes filling with tears. But instead of crying, she felt the fear begin to turn into panic. She turned on her headlights and pulled out of the parking lot, heading home to her sanctuary. When she pulled up to her mansion, her heart sank. There was a group of people standing at the gate. They had signs that said, "No to racism. Justice for Jason. We stand against hate." Their faces were filled with anger and disappointment. As soon as they saw her car, one of them shouted, "There it is." She stopped, afraid to move further. The people came closer. Their cries grew louder. She tried not to look at them, but the words pierced her like needles. "You are a disgrace. How can you live with this? You deserve to pay." She turned the car sharply, driving around the crowd, and entered the garage through a different entrance. After closing the gate, she jumped out of the car and ran into the house as if she was being chased. After locking the door, she leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. But the house that had always been her fortress now seemed empty and cold. Her footsteps echoed through the hallways. She turned on the television, hoping to find some comfort, but the face on the screen was Amelia James. "We must fight hatred wherever it is," the governor said. "This incident is not just about my son. It is about every person who has faced injustice, and we will not stop until the truth prevails." The words sent a chill down Mrs. Whitman's spine. She changed the channel, but it was the same story. The headlines read, "Racist Incident at Elite Club. Woman vs. Governor. Battle for Justice." She turned off the television, but the sounds of the news seemed to linger in her head. Her world was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her attempts to protect herself only increased her isolation. No one was on her side anymore. She sat her down on the couch, her head in her hands. Her thoughts swirled in her head, every word Amelia and Jason had said echoing over and over again. She was beginning to understand. Her confidence, her convictions, her power had all been an illusion. She was vulnerable, and now her own actions had become a weapon against her. Night came, but there was no sleep. She sat her in the darkness, surrounded by a silence that pressed on her more than any scream. Whitman's home, once bright and stately, now seemed dark and empty. Even the mirrors reflected not the confidence of her past, but fear and loneliness. Several days had passed since her public humiliation, but the calls, letters, and protests continued. Her name had become a symbol of hatred, and every morning began with new headlines in the newspapers and another wave of condemnation on social media. She turned off her phone, trying to shut out the outside world, but the silence was no consolation. Instead, it became her worst enemy. Every whistle of the wind outside her window made her shudder. Every rustle in the house reminded her of the screams of those gathered at her gate. She could no longer leave the house without protection. Her neighbors avoided her, and her friends, who had once admired her influence, now preferred to distance themselves. Meanwhile, Jason and his mother, Amelia, continued their fight. The story spread far beyond the club. Amelia used the opportunity to draw attention to the broader issue of racism and discrimination. She appeared on television, organized meetings with community leaders, and initiated legislation aimed at strengthening the rights of people with disabilities. "This isn't just about my son," she said in an interview. This is about every person who faces injustice every day. We can't allow hate to be the norm. Amelia's words resonated. Her determination inspired people who had previously remained silent for fear of the consequences. Activist groups began to support her initiative, drawing attention to cases of discrimination that had previously gone unnoticed. For Mrs. Whitman, it was unbearable. Every day brought new blows to her reputation. Her husband's company, with which she was associated, was losing clients. Her children, who attended prestigious schools, faced the condemnation of their peers. Her life, built on status and power, was collapsing like a house of cards. She tried to seek help. She called lawyers to defend her name, but even they refused to work with her, fearing to ruin their reputation. "We can't afford to be associated with this scandal," one of them said when she tried to explain her position. She felt her fear growing. It was all-consuming, like a dark shadow that grew larger with each passing day. She couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were filled with scenes from the club, the cries of the protesters, Amelia's words. One evening, as she sat her day in her living room, there was a knock on the door. It was loud, insistent. Her heart began to pound. She walked slowly to the door and opened it. Amelia James stood there. Mrs. Whitman frowned. She had expected to see anyone but her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice weak. Amelia looked at her calmly, her eyes expressing not anger but determination. "I didn't come to humiliate you. I came to give you a chance to correct your mistakes." Whitman asked, her lips trembling. "You mean all this can still be fixed?" Amelia nodded. "It's up to you. You can continue to resist, stay alone, and build a wall of hatred around yourself. Or you can step forward, admit your mistakes, and try to change yourself." "Why are you giving me this chance?" Whitman asked, her voice filled with doubt and fear. "Because good always wins," Amelia replied. "Hate can't be our answer. We have to be better." These words touched something deep inside Whitman. She looked at Amelia for a long time, her gaze full of confusion and pain. Finally, she lowered her eyes and said quietly, "I don't know how to do this." Amelia put a hand on her shoulder. "Start simple. Admit your mistakes, apologize, and help those you've hurt." That night was a turning point. The next day, Mrs. Whitman made a statement. She publicly acknowledged her mistakes, apologized to Jason, his family, and everyone she had hurt. She offered to help advance Amelia's cause, and promised to fight the hatred that had defined her life for so long. The world did not forgive her immediately, but her sincere actions began to change people's attitudes. Her isolation gave way to a slow but steady process of redemption. And Jason and Amelia continued their journey, inspiring others. This story became a symbol of how kindness and justice can change everything. And even those who were once on the side of hatred can find a path to forgiveness and change. Friends, thank you for watching this story to the end. It evokes a lot of emotions and makes you think about what people around us are facing. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Maybe you or your loved ones have had similar cases. How did you cope with it? We would be glad to hear your thoughts and stories, because your voices are incredibly important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful that you are with us. If this story resonated with you, please support us by liking and subscribing to the channel. This will help us create even more content that inspires and opens our eyes to important topics. We wish you a good and bright day. Remember, good always wins, and your actions can change the world for the better.